His right arm was gone. His left eye was blind. His spine was bent so severely he could barely have stood upright. And when archaeologists found his skeleton in a cave in northern Iraq in 1957, their first instinct was to calculate how quickly he must have died. But the bones told a different story. Shanidar I, as they named him, had not died young. He had lived for decades with those injuries, in one of the most brutal environments our species has ever inhabited. Someone had fed him. Someone had kept him alive, year after year, long after he became a burden by every practical measure. And here's what makes this truly astonishing. He was not even human. He was a Neanderthal. And this one skeleton raises a question that nobody in science had thought to ask before. Why would any group of ancient humans keep a useless member alive? The answer to that question does not just change archaeology. It changes everything we think we understand about what humans owe each other. And it explains something about our world today that nobody wants to admit out loud. Start with what Shanidar I was not. He was not a pet. He was not a symbol. Ancient survival was brutal, and every calorie his group spent feeding him was a calorie taken from someone else. They had every rational reason to leave him behind, and yet they didn't. Anthropologists call this care for the vulnerable. And for a long time, they assumed it was a uniquely modern human trait. Then they kept finding more skeletons like his. At La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France, an elderly Neanderthal man had lost nearly all of his teeth. His jaw had partially resorbed. He had survived for years on food that someone else had softened or chewed for him. In Romito, Italy, a young Upper Paleolithic human with a severe bone disorder that made normal movement almost impossible had survived well into adulthood, in a group that hunted megafauna for survival. These were not accidents. These were choices. The question is, why? And here is where it gets interesting, because the reason had nothing to do with compassion. In a world without books, without writing, without any external storage of information, the human mind was the only library that existed, and the oldest minds held the most knowledge. Think about what an elder actually represented in a group of 50 people living off the land. They had survived droughts the young had never seen. They remembered which plants had killed someone 30 years ago. They knew which rivers flooded in which seasons. They carried in their heads the accumulated trial and error of an entire lifetime, every mistake they had survived, every pattern they had noticed in the landscape. Killing or abandoning that person did not just end a life, it deleted a library. And in a world where one wrong decision could kill the entire group, that library was worth more than any spear. But nobody had any idea how much it was worth. Until 2004. That year, paleoanthropologist Rachel Caspari published a study that quietly shook the entire field of human evolution. She had spent years analyzing fossil teeth from hominids spanning hundreds of thousands of years, using wear patterns to estimate the age of individuals at death. The data was enormous. The conclusion was something nobody had predicted. Around 30,000 years ago, there was a sudden and dramatic explosion in the number of individuals surviving into old age. For the first time in the fossil record, grandparents appeared in significant numbers. And this moment coincides almost exactly with what archaeologists call the creative explosion. The sudden emergence of complex cave art, sophisticated tools, bone needles, long-distance trade networks, musical instruments, personal ornaments, everything that makes us recognizably human appears at roughly the same moment that grandparents became common. Caspari argued this was not a coincidence. The grandparents were the catalyst. More grandparents meant more accumulated knowledge being transmitted. More knowledge meant better survival rates. Better survival rates meant more grandparents. It was a feedback loop, and it built civilization. Now, here's where the story takes a turn nobody saw coming. Humans are among the only mammals on Earth where females live for decades past reproductive age. From a purely biological standpoint, this makes no sense. Evolution favors reproduction. Why would natural selection preserve a body that can no longer have children? For most of the 20th century, scientists had no answer. Then evolutionary biologist Kristen Hawk spent years studying the Hadza, a hunter-gatherer group in Tanzania, and what she documented rewrote the textbooks. Grandmothers were foraging constantly, not for themselves, for their grandchildren. They were freeing up their daughters to have more children sooner. They were teaching skills, resolving conflicts, holding the social memory of the group. Postmenopausal women were not an evolutionary dead end. They were an advantage so powerful that our species had restructured itself around them. We did not just tolerate our elderly, we evolved to need them, and they knew their worth. The Sunghir burial in Russia, dating back 34,000 years, tells you everything you need to know. Archaeologists uncovered the remains of an elderly man covered with more than 3,000 beads made from mammoth ivory, each one individually carved and perforated by hand. Researchers estimated it would have taken a single person over 10,000 hours to produce them all. That is not how you bury a burden. That is how you bury someone you considered sacred. And then something changed. Not suddenly, not with a single invention, but gradually, across centuries. We built a world where the knowledge stored in old minds became less essential. Writing appeared. Cities emerged. Industrialization arrived. Standardized education. The internet. Every innovation that made information easier to store and retrieve also made the living archive of an elderly mind slightly less valuable. And so we reorganized our entire social structure around that shift. We built institutions to house them. We built cultures that celebrated youth. We stopped sitting with them at night and listening. And today, the average adult in the developed world spends less than 4 hours per year in meaningful conversation with an elderly relative. 4 hours per year. Compared to 10,000 hours of carved ivory for a single man who died 34,000 years ago. What that cost us is not abstract. Researchers studying social isolation in the elderly have found that chronic loneliness produces physiological effects equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It accelerates cognitive decline. It suppresses immune function. It shortens life. Studies of cultures that maintain strong intergenerational bonds consistently show lower rates of depression in both the young and the old. Children with regular contact with grandparents develop higher emotional intelligence and stronger resilience. The grandmother effect that Hawks documented in the Hadza does not disappear in modern societies. It just goes unused. We still have the hardware. We stopped running the software. Somewhere right now, there is an elderly person sitting alone in a room, maybe a nursing home, maybe an apartment, maybe your own grandmother's house. And the last time you called, you can't quite remember when that was. We treat this as normal. We treat it as just how things are. But a Neanderthal with one arm, one eye, and a spine that had been shattered and healed looked at the oldest member of his group and saw something worth feeding every single day. He saw a library. He saw a survival mechanism. He saw something so valuable that abandoning it was unthinkable. We built a civilization advanced enough to store all human knowledge on a device that fits in your pocket. And somehow along the way, we forgot what that Neanderthal knew. The most valuable thing in your world right now might be sitting alone in a room, waiting for you to call.